Hello and welcome to another edition of Betting People. This week's special guest will be a familiar face to many of you because you will have seen him on Sky Sports Racing. I am, of course, talking about Tim Carroll. Tim, how are you? And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, William.
Let's get straight into it with a question that many people would have been dying to ask you. So we actually asked for some questions on Twitter, and I think this summed it up pretty well. Patrick Hayes, whose question should be on the screen, asks, how many lengths would Frankel have beaten Winks by? Now, he's given a scenario, to be fair to him, 10 furlongs at York on good to soft ground. Tim, take it away.
Well, firstly, Patrick's been a little bit presumptive. Who's to say Frankel would have beaten Winks? But look, in all seriousness, if you're talking about the Juddmonte at York, where he was hugely impressive, I think he had, was it Far and St Nicholas Abbey, 7 lengths in behind that day.
Yep.
Look, I'll be honest, Frankel live is the best horse I've ever seen. So I would agree that he would have beaten Winks that day. Not so sure about the Champion Stakes, but he would have beaten her that day. But she would have finished a lot closer than the others. So we've actually got a fairly good gauge there. And I'm being very basic here. You're talking about proximity. But for argument's sake, you had a horse like So You Think, who was also from Australia. And she's a better horse than So You Think. So You Think had also defeated or finished in front of Nathaniel. He didn't actually win the race. Not Nathaniel, sorry, St Nicholas Abbey. Had finished in front of him and also had beaten Far. So I think chances are that the Winks would have given him some sort of race, but yeah, we are talking about Frankel, who many would say is the greatest horse ever.
Very fair indeed. Just as an interesting thing, where do you get the idea that Winks, and I'm not saying that it isn't correct, I'm on the ratings it is, but you seem very confident there that Winks was much better than So You Think. So You Think was a very, very good horse, both in Australia and when moved to Ireland. Any reason behind that confidence in your thinking?
Yeah, well, look, I think she was more versatile. You've got to remember she ran peak figures over 6.5 furlongs to 10 furlongs. Her overall, if we're talking about time form, I think he went to 133, she went to 134 with a bullet, i.e. she could have gone higher. Plus she would have had a mare's allowance. But I'll tell you a little story very quickly, actually. I was doing a show called World of Racing for, back then it was ATR, and I was in Australia recording the show, and 2 of our guests were Chris Waller and Hugh Bowman. Now, just so I can set this up so you understand, Hugh's very much a country boy. He is definitely not overstated. Not too much phases him. And I said to Hugh, look, there's all this debate in Europe how the Winks went over there and took on the Europeans, took on a name, would she be able to beat those sort of horses? I said, you'd have a pretty good idea. What a lot of people don't realise is Hugh's the only person to have ridden So You Think and Winks. And I said to Hugh, you'd have a pretty good idea having ridden So You Think and Winks. And honestly, he just looked at me blankly for a second, and then in exact words, I promise you, he said, oh, she'd beat So You Think hands down. Now, I think Hugh would have a pretty good idea which was the better horse. Having said that, that's not a knock on So You Think. I mean, to win 10 Group 1s, 5 in each hemisphere, and he had a fairly audacious campaign. That penultimate campaign speaks for itself. But if you look at it from an Australian point of view, I think most people in Australia would say Winks was a superior horse to So You Think.
And just looking for an Australian point of view again, how do the Australian racing community perceive So You Think's campaigning, which was a point of contention around that time when he was with Aidan O'Brien?
Yeah, well, I think Bart Cummings is previous trainer, and Bart's a Hall of Fame trainer. I actually wrote a bit of work for Bart back in the day, and the man's a genius, so he should be respected. But there's no doubt Bart was not overly impressed with losing the horse. I think it sort of all happened, I wouldn't say secretly, that's the wrong way to say it, but it all happened very suddenly. And Bart was a little bit sort of, they're training this horse upside down, which is a little bit unfair because as an Australian based over here, I know that there's different considerations over here. But I do think that penultimate campaign, certainly the second half of it, went the wheels fell off a little. When I say the wheels fell off, they've got a lot of considerations, Coolmore, and they ended up sending him to the Arc. Now, you've got to remember, he was a very speedy horse back home. I remember him being beaten in a Group 1 mile because he went too quick from the front wearing blinkers. I think to go from sort of being this sort of mile to a mile and a quarter horse and having to step up to the Arc where they lightened him off, as Aidan O'Brien himself said, back to Champions Day, where he got beaten and he looked just a little bit flat. He looked like a 12 furlong horse in a 10 furlong race. And then to go over to the breeders to go onto the dirt. Now, I'm assuming he went on to the dirt because they hadn't St Nicholas Abbey for the turf. Now, he just finished in front of St Nick in the Arc, despite having a worse race set up. I think that's why they went to the dirt, and they put the blinkers on, and he took a tug like he did in Australia when they put the blinkers on. So I think it all went a little bit skew-whiff, and I think a lot of people would think that he could have had a better record if maybe campaigned a little bit differently. But to be fair to Aidan O'Brien, I remember I was at Royal Ascot the following year when he came back and he won before he was retired. And Aidan sat down at the presser and he said, look, I had a good chat to Joseph, who was riding him out. And Joseph said, look, we've got to change his training regime. We've got to lighten up on this horse and just let him be a racehorse again, because he was very bullish as a younger horse. And that seemed to help. And Aid, I mean, it might have been a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but he sort of threw out a few apologies to Bart Cummings and anyone else that was a little bit concerned about the previous campaign. But he sort of said, we probably didn't train the horse the right way. I do remember him actually saying that might have been at that presser that the work he put into him before the Arc, a lesser horse wouldn't have even survived the work regime. So, to answer your question, I think there's a lot of considerations that the average person, especially in Australia, that's not familiar with the setup over here, doesn't have. But yes, I think in hindsight they might have done things a bit differently.
Indeed, and just going back right to the start, how did you get into racing?
Well, look, I actually went through the betting side to start with. My grandparents were slightly illegal SP bookmakers in Melbourne. I used to run a shop out the back of the house, which was fairly active on Saturdays. And I was allowed to have my first bet. I think I was around 7 years of age on Battle Heights when he won the Cox Plate, a good old campaigner from New Zealand. I was allowed to have that bet through family. I didn't walk down to the betting shop and put it on, obviously. And after that, I was hooked. When I went to school, I used to run a little bit of a book on the rugby league, the NRL over there. I think it was called ARL back then. The idea of trying to take everyone's pocket money, and mostly it was fairly successful. And I always enjoyed sport. I was always on the small side back then. It's before I kind of filled out a bit. And I'd always ridden horses because I grew up in the country in a place called Armidale. And while we lived in town, a lot of my friends that I went to school with, their families owned property. So you go out horse riding and motorbike riding, do all the things that rural kids do. So I decided to go and be a jockey because I loved the game. I could ride horses, and at the time I was small, so it sort of went from there.
Must ask, your best and worst ride as a jockey? All in your opinion, of course.
Well, okay. Well, the one that annoys me the most is, I remember a New Zealand horse called Brook Twile, and what had happened on the day, I was riding in a place called Brockhampton, which is a provincial area that's got a really strong racing base, and they'd had a lot of rain there, and I'd ridden the turf track a few times. They had an inside track, a sand track, and because of the rain, they'd moved the races onto the sand. I'd never ridden it. It was a tight turning track like those little dirt tracks you see in America. And I rode this horse. He normally sat forward. I'd ridden him a couple of times before. And as we came to the bend, I mean, normally you'd sort of make your move as you straighten up, let them balance up a little bit. I had a fair bit of horse underneath me, but he was a bit, not that he had his ability, but he was a bit like Highland Real in that he was just a relentless type galloper. He wasn't a sit and sprint horse. He wouldn't go 0 to 100 in 0.3 of a second. And there was a jockey there, one of the best jockeys I've ever seen, that no one would have heard of because he was happy being a big fish in a small pond, Wally Wellburn. And all of a sudden, he flew past me on this horse on the outside, and I had to get going and chase him. And I got beaten literally that far. And I came back and no one said anything. They were quite happy with the run and everything. I was fuming because I knew Wally had just outridden me. I got caught napping, so to speak. In my defence, I didn't know the track, but look, it was just one of those races that I knew I should have won. So needless to say, 6 months later, I was still sort of maybe not having nightmares about it, but I was still dirty on myself because I was very competitive. Still am, to be fair, but I was very competitive back then. I'd have a bit of a sulk if I got beaten. I knew I shouldn't have. As far as my best day goes, I mean, keep it in mind, I'm not riding more Frankie Dettori. I wasn't around for too long. I wasn't riding in the Melbourne Cup and things like that, but one of the first days I rode, and I know you've got a time limit here, so I'll speed this up, but I went to an invitational meeting out in the country, And I rode a double actually.
Mm.
And after riding the double, I think I had 5 rides for 2 winners and the other 3 places. So it was a nice little day out. And afterwards, you go and join the connections in the bar, actually, of all places. That's just the way it was those days. And the owner was actually he owned pubs, but his main thing, he had a big farm the size of a county, basically. And anyone would have thought I'd won the Derby or the Melbourne Cup for him. And this was just a little country meeting. I actually rode 2 winners for him, both winners for him. I found out later that he'd always had at least 1 horse in work and hadn't had a winner for 10 years. So to him, this whole thing was magical. And just for a moment there, I kind of felt, I don't know, I just felt like Frankie Dettori having won the Derby or something like that. But I was just so pleased for the owners. That kind of meant more to me than the win itself, for me. And yeah, it's sort of days like that when you sit here as an older man and you're a bit overweight and that. It's those sort of days you look back on that sort of bring you the fondest memories.
Absolutely. Out of interest, was there any other sport that you played? Was the plan always to be a jockey, or did it come through sort of chance? I mean, your parents did run a bookmaking shop of their own, but were you interested in, say, NFL or AFL, I should say, or something like that?
Rugby league. I played juniors for what was known as East, now the Sydney Roosters. I'm still a member there. I played league. I played cricket to a reasonable level both days, but to be honest with you, I just wasn't good enough to make a career out of it. I was always on the small side. I mean, even when I was a jockey, I was still playing rugby league. I'd ride a winner on a Saturday and try to score a try on a Sunday. But the honest truth is I wasn't good enough. They would have been the 2 games away from horse racing that I would have liked to have excelled at if I had that sort of ability.
Okay, doke. And just to sort of round this all up, you moved to racing media in, I believe it was the early 1990s. How did that come about?
I was very lucky. I was in the right place at the right time. I'd given away riding. I was at a little bit of a loose end. I decided I didn't want to go into training because I just thought it was too risky. I'd seen too many good people who knew what they were doing, that worked hard, that never made it. I ran a sports centre for an owner that I'd ridden for about 18 months. And 18 months into that, another ex-owner I used to ride for, he was the general manager of a radio station that was purely aimed at mostly horse racing, actually, but it was horse racing / sport. He knew my background. He said to me, Tim, he said, I think you've got a really good voice for radio, which I suppose was a compliment, but, it might have been a way of saying, but, you haven't really got a face for TV, but we'd like to offer you a traineeship. And to be fair, the traineeship wasn't worth a lot of money. It was a fair bit less than what I was earning at the time. And it was a 2-year traineeship. So I said to Ted, can we cut the traineeship back to a year? And if I'm good enough after a year, I am. And if I'm not, I'm not. And he agreed to that. So I went and did it. And everything just fell into place. There was 2 main presenters, and one actually left to go on to bigger and better things. And the other one had a big fallout with the boss, with Ted. So within 3 months, I was kind of the head presenter. So I sort of had to learn as I went. I mean, I obviously knew the product, but I had to learn how to present. And it was a really good grounding. And it just kind of grew from there.
Would there be any particular lessons from that time that you really feel made you into sort of the presenter you are today?
Yeah, I think so. Again, I was lucky because I was playing in a small pond again. So I was, you can't be as raw as what I was and go straight on to Sky Sports Racing, say. So the thing that I learned very quickly, 2 things actually, to this day. Firstly, know your topic, know what you're talking about. If you ever go into air, be armed with all the information you can possibly have. And the second thing is have plenty of conviction in what you're saying. Don't be iffy. Don't be shy. It doesn't matter whether whether you're talking to Aidan O'Brien, whether you're talking to Ryan Moore, whether you're talking to some owner that no one's ever heard of. Have conviction in what you're saying. And if you know what you're talking about, or you believe you know what you're talking about, then you're fully justifiable to have that conviction. I mean, I quite often I'll interview a trainer or a jockey. Now, I'm not saying I do, but I like to go into that interview feeling I know more about the form of the horse we're talking about than they do. Now, it's probably not the case. And obviously they know all the idiosyncrasies of having that horse 24/7 in the yard. But that's the way you should feel when you go into an interview or when you present.
And as somebody who's in the racing media, would you have any advice for somebody looking to follow in your footsteps or to break into any part of it, written online or maybe in front of cameras you have done?
I think you've got to be persistent. It's a difficult industry to break into simply because if you're working in racing media, I mean, I don't know too many people working in racing media that don't love racing, and if you don't love racing, you shouldn't work in the industry for your own sake. So the majority of people are doing it are all hooked on what they're doing, and at the end of the day, I mean, whether it be writing or whether it be like I do presenting, if you can get paid to talk about something you love, that's a pretty good gig. So it is difficult to get in. But having said that, if you're persistent enough and you approach it the right way, I mean, don't just give up because 2 or 3 doors close. You will get in, and once you get in, well, it's like anything. You've got to work hard. You've got to listen, try to learn as much as you can, and hopefully go from there. I never did it. I've never done media training, not a day of it in my whole entire life. But if you really want to get into media, especially today, because it's very cutthroat. If you want to get into racing media, I would recommend to any young person out there, certainly go and do some sort of media training if you can.
I think a very, very sensible note upon which to end part 1 of Betting People with Tim Carroll. Stay tuned for part 2 tomorrow. Tim, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, William.